We are a growing global movement of over 50,000 young people. The Youth in Landscapes Initiative was born when a group of forestry students and young agricultural professionals came together, recognizing the need to combine forces and give voice to youth working in landscapes around the world. 6 years on, we are a thriving and diverse community offering workshops, mentorship, training, and networking. Whether online or in person, the Youth in Landscapes Initiative programs connect, support, and inspire young people to step into courageous leadership, a leadership that breaks barriers and brings people together to act differently. Join the community, be part of the change.
Hello, everybody. Hi. It's a pleasure to have you on board already for the Youth Digital Forum Restore Our Planet. On behalf of the Youth in Landscapes Initiative and the Global Landscapes Forum, we are sending out a huge welcome to you all. Thank you so much. We are also sending to you our warmest wishes for health and safety in these challenging times of the COVID-19 pandemic. While we're moving forward to face continuing challenges such as the climate crisis, biodiversity, and habitat loss, as well as ocean pollution, we must learn from the solidarity and determination that the global community has shown during this health crisis. We, as the future leaders of this world, have the responsibility and the opportunity to imagine and create a more sustainable, more equitable, more resilient, and more prosperous world that will leave no one behind, whilst protecting our precious planet. Before proceeding, I'd like to give a short introduction to the Youth in Landscapes Initiative. YIL is a growing global network of youth organizations led by the International Forestry Students Association, IFSA, the Young Professionals for Agricultural Development, YPARD, and the Global Agroecology Alliance, GAIA. Together, these organizations aim at uniting and empowering youth from diverse backgrounds around the world to have a public voice and to create positive changes for the sustainability of their landscapes and community livelihoods. Today, we're here to explore how the youth will play this role, specifically during the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This event, organized by the ELF and YIL in partnership with Wageningen University Youth for Landscapes Forum and the International Forestry Students Association, is part of the Generation Restoration Program, of which you will have the possibility to hear more later today. So before that, today we're going to learn more about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we're going to explore how it will play a role in amplifying youth leadership. We're going to learn and explore what is the perfect recipe for a restoration project. And then we will have the opportunity to get to know each other in the facilitating networking session. Of course, this event would have not been possible without the support of the project teams. 2 teams of volunteers have been supporting GLF and YIL in the development of this event. And we want to hear from them a short introduction of today's session in a short video. So let's watch it.
Welcome to the Youth Forum Restore Our Planet.
This forum, taking place on the 2nd of June, aims at gathering young professionals working in the restoration field, as well as young people new to the topic.
For those of you new to restoration, feel free to browse around our website, learn about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, understand the landscape approach, participate in our live activities, or simply get to know the Youth in Landscape Initiative. We are very happy to have you on board.
For those of you already involved in restoration, don't miss our live events. Tune in to learn more about how to shape the movement and participate in Generation Restoration, and discover all the events planned for 2020. Very exciting opportunities will be announced.
In general, you can always check the agenda to join our live events and networking activities, and browse around the website to find out about all the different ways to participate in the Youth Forum and in GLF Bonn Digital Conference 2020.
Let's restore our planet together.
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 So to hear your opinions, we're going to be using Slido. It's very easy. You just need to go to the website slide.do, enter the code #GLFBond2020. That's the official hashtag, and click on youth. So once you are there, you're going to have the possibility to answer the questions and let us know where you are watching, which city, but also where you're joining us from. Your garden, your sofa, your living room, whatever. We want to hear from you. So help us also spread the word and post everywhere on social media about the event. And remember, of course, to use the official hashtags, which are #GenerationRestoration and #GLFBond2020. I think we are already, we're ready to see the introduction video. So without further ado, we're going to see the video a bit later. First, I want to start today with our opening session, which is titled "A Decade to Restore the Planet and Amplify Youth Leadership." For this, I'd like to invite on stage Musonda Mumba, Chief Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit, UN Environment; Amos Amunovo, President of the International Forestry Students Association; Rafael Forceto, International Affairs Analyst and Journalist from Brazil; Shie Bastida, Climate Activist, and our amazing moderator, Mayumi Sato, Yale alumna and fellow at the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness.
Thanks so much, Andrea, for the introduction, and a warm welcome to everyone who is watching from Bonn, Sao Paulo, Jakarta, and towns and cities from around the world for today's Youth Forum, Restore Our Planet. We are lucky to be with 4 leaders working on issues on climate change adaptation, social justice, migration, and youth leadership in landscape restoration. So in this session today, we aspire to understand a bit more about the role that young leaders and people will be playing during the upcoming UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, as well as how the decade will be an opportunity to amplify youth leadership. To start off, I'd like to ask a question to Musonda. Musonda, could you give us a short background and explanation of the UN Decade and the youth consultations that have been carried out over the past year, and some examples of how you envision youth to partake in it? So I think, we will actually currently experiencing some change in lineup. So we will actually go to our second speaker, and then we will get to Musonda as our fourth speaker. So our first question will actually be to Amos. So as president of a global youth association and a part of the Yale Steering Committee, can you share with us your experience with how young people are increasingly working together globally to pursue restoration efforts, and how you envision the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration to amplify this?
Thank you very much, Mayumi, for inviting me and for that wonderful question. I just want to quickly put forth 2 points. The first thing is, I believe that before Musonda would even give an introduction about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the connection of young people to this Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, I believe that our listeners today somehow already know or have a connection to this Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So when we talk about UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in relation to the youth, I see 2 things. I see the youth in 2 perspectives. I see them as major actors and stakeholders, because we have all the strategic plan on paper. we have all the consultations done, and we have all the actions that should be taken. But who is going to take this action? That is where I see the youth as a big role player, as an actor. And then what do I see youth as? I see youth as victims as well, because then if we do not act right now, if we do not play an active role in this UN decade on ecosystem restoration, it's a decade. 10 years from now, youth will have to bear the brand of not acting now. So one thing I am happy about in relation to the question is we have seen how actively youth are taking leadership in pursuit of restoration efforts. Just before the decade, we saw an uprise of youth movements. I mean, these youth movements have created a very critical civic space. They have also created a very huge policy momentum, because we have the youth, the young people have the numbers to kind of try to inform and influence policy actions. So one of the critical actions that young people have done or have worked together is these youth mass movements that we're seeing globally. And just like we have youth in landscapes, that either informs policy in some way from the youth perspective or helps to act in the landscape context. And one of the biggest things that the youth have done globally, working towards achieving, pursuing restoration, you can see knowledge sharing. Youth have formed lots of knowledge sharing platforms and initiatives. This ranges from storytelling to online learning initiatives. I mean, I think these are very powerful tools that the youth are using in the lead to the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, to build capacity within the youth networks and to ensure that they are in position to act on any strategic plans that come out of these proposed plans. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amos. So you talk a lot about the importance of building a critical mass and the necessity to do that through this youth movement. Our next speaker has great experience in regards to help building up this momentum. So Xie, in the last year, more and more young people have grown awareness about climate change and the importance of taking action in the first place. This is in part due to movements like Friday for Future that are mobilizing thousands of youth around the world. So what is the role that you see climate activism can play in the upcoming decade on ecosystem restoration?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, Amos, because I think that you really dug into what we're doing exactly. But yeah, I have been, organizing for climate justice in the youth movement for the past year, and the movement has grown exponentially. The first global climate strike in New York City, we had 5,000 students joining, and for the September 20th one, we had 300,000. So we're seeing the network that we're being able to build. One of the things that I think is important in how we're going to tackle ecosystem restoration is that, for example, the reason why I care so much about addressing climate issues and biodiversity and ecosystem issues is because I was raised that way. So I come from the Otomi indigenous community in central Mexico, and I was raised with the philosophy that you take care of the earth because that's what we're supposed to do. So I think that a lot of us in the climate movement are advocating for climate education, comprehensive climate education that doesn't only focus on the problems, but also on the solutions. One that could raise us as to show us that climate activism is not a hobby, is a way of life, is a mentality in which we're gonna realize how we have to relate to the world around us, to relate to each other, to achieve a more just and equitable world. So I think that climate education is going to play a huge a huge role in how youth are going to react, and climate activists are calling for this type of climate education. The second thing is that I feel like youth are becoming huge voices for advocacy against injustice, and now we're seeing that 254 million tons of waste is produced in the US. Oh, I'm like getting all this sun. But all that waste ends up in Southeast Asian countries and Singapore, Malaysia, and that is an injustice. So, and that plays a huge role in the pollution of ecosystems. So I feel like now, in like Amos was saying, in this chains of learning and chains of teaching that we're creating in the youth space, we're able to teach each other about the injustices that we have to tackle in our own local governments to prevent pollution in the first place, and then go into restoring ecosystems because of the things that we have learned. So I think climate activism is going to play a huge role, specifically because of our ability to network and our ability to have like a rippling effect around the world.
Thanks so much, Xie. So you spoke a lot about the necessity to tackle injustices and how that space needs to be done through youth-led movements and climate education. Raphael, your work centers around documenting and filming underrepresented voices impacted by climate change. How do you think that the media can serve as a critical tool in changing the narrative and amplifying youth leadership for local restoration?
Thank you, Mayumi. Thank you, Amos and Chia as well. Well, I want to start off with a quick rhetorical question. If you guys turn on your local news station right now, what do you think you're going to see? If you watch it for a couple of hours, you'll probably hear about the global pandemic. You'll definitely hear about social and racial tensions. You'll hear about the protests all over the world. But how often are you going to hear about climate change? And when you do, how often is that going to be positive news? I can tell you that here in Latin America, it's usually not. Forest fires, natural disasters, or just data on how we're destroying our planet. And don't get me wrong, the data is extremely important, but not everybody identifies with numbers and statistics. In fact, in my experience, a lot of people, average people, don't get involved in climate action because they can't relate to it. And I think that's where the youth really plays a pivotal role, because they're really leading when it takes to, when it's about bringing positive action to the mainstream. And positive action rarely makes headlines, but over the past 2 or 3 years, the youth have really been changing that narrative. And it's really important to share these hopeful stories because it makes the conversation more inclusive, especially during the decade on ecosystem restoration. But focusing on local actions, we can make things more relatable to the average person. In fact, here's an example. Last year, I worked on a short film on agroecological plantations here in Brazil. We talked to small crop farmers on agroecology, agroforestry, and producing organic food. We expected a good response, but nothing like what we saw. We had over 100,000 people view our video, and we were getting questions left and right about how to get involved, how can we learn more about agroecology, and how can we support local farmers and land restoration. That's when we really realized that these positive climate stories bring positive climate reactions. And I believe the best way we can going forward is to focus on the youth, because they're simply the most outspoken group when it comes to these issues. Youth activists are always involved in their local sphere, and their voices should be amplified to really inspire others to get involved in local restoration. They're disruptive. They cut through all the political jargon, but they're also extremely inclusive. So you have people from all backgrounds, all nationalities, and they make it very clear that climate change doesn't affect only one group of people, it affects our whole planet. So we should really focus on coupling the media and the youth to really change the narrative and amplify their leadership, especially during the UN decade on ecosystem restoration.
Thanks so much, Raphael. So we are actually going to go back to Musonda. So we just heard the past three speakers, Amos, Xie, and Raphael, talk about how they are tackling social and climate injustices in Uganda, in the US, and in Brazil, and in addressing this global movement. I'm just wondering if you could give us a short background and explanation of the UN decade and the youth consultations that have been carried out over the past year, and some of the examples of how you envision youth will partake in this movement.
Thank you so much, and apologies for that glitch in technology. Welcome to everyone joining us from wherever you're joining us from around the world, and the amazing speakers. It's great to actually, I'm glad that it's happened this way, because just listening to them and seeing them really gives me the impetus to even explain why this particular decade matters. So the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration was passed as a UN United Nations General Assembly resolution on the 1st of March 2019 in New York. And this really came out of a need and a call through the Global Landscapes Forum process, through the former Minister of Environment of El Salvador, Lina Paul. And Lina really moved this, this agenda and reached out to the rest of the world and say, look, the world is getting degraded and these are the challenges. Can we actually have a UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration? And within 6 months that happened. It almost doesn't happen within the UN process. Now, what did we do after that? I think what both, all the speakers have alluded to is really the role and power of the youth, and something we as UN Environment and the FAO, the two UN agencies taking the leadership and guidance for the decade, really recognized, because we see youth as instrumental and central to this process. So basically what we did was to really have global consultations in at least a minimum of 20 countries, reaching youth across the world. And this was like virtual consultations where we had opportunities. We would have, during the UN General Assembly, meetings, during the COPs, climate COPs, for example, have on-ground consultations. And it was amazing. The feedback, the reactions to see, and what the young people have spoken about now is really something that emerged. I was really glad that Amos touched on the whole issue of how can we have these knowledge spaces of sharing. This was something that emerged and something that was a call. Can we have a hub, a virtual hub where youth are sharing experiences? And the reality is this decade starts 2021 through to 2030. It's not a long time, it's 10 years. The three of you will be in one form or another a leader in government or in some organization, or a negotiator in negotiating text around issues related to climate and restoration. So for us, we see this decade as something that brings up this momentum and drive. And now I think what I've seen, at least in the processes I've been engaged in, is young people telling us, look, you're either with us or just get out of the way. And we really want to move forward on this really for the purpose of our survival on this planet. And lastly, but not the least, I think one of the things that really emerged in this consultative process and what we've seen is also to figure out what innovative initiatives can emerge through, the issue of restoration, landscape entrepreneurship, for example. I mean, Africa as a continent is a young continent. How do we look about creating jobs, green jobs? And now I think with the COVID crisis, we have an opportunity to even reflect around that and think through that. And that, applies to Latin America, it applies to Asia, even Europe right now. How do we build back better and greener and differently? Because I think what COVID has done is really to show us and put us in a sorry corner that we have to have a moment of pause and really reflect what we've done to the earth and come back. And that normal that we dealt with before is no longer valid. We have to now do a different normal and a different shift and a change. And I think youth are really central to that.
Thank you, Musonda. So this actually worked out perfectly in terms of the next question, and this will be for all four of you. So perhaps we will start back with you, Musonda, actually, and then we will move to Amos, then Shiet, then Rafael. So how can the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration leverage on existing youth networks and movements while amplifying their impact?
Thank you for that. I think it can leverage on that. I mean, listening to Shia, for me, it was exciting to see, first of all, she's an indigenous voice. And then secondly, she's a young person who's been involved with climate activism and all of that. I think for us, what we know for sure is that restoration is happening because our landscapes are degraded, and climate change will even compound, its impacts will compound on that. So we need to really tap into all these different networks. It's good to hear what Rafael is talking about, the media. How do we, really use media differently? So I think we see this as an opportunity, the power of storytelling. And I think the greatest thing that has happened right now is that, the power of the digital space and the democratization of this space. Storytelling from just taking pictures from your camera, phone camera, or doing a video about your landscape. We even started in one of the initiatives that I lead on the network of African women environmentalists with a youth voice, like with Vanessa Nakate, who's a climate activist from Uganda. We've started Adopt a Landscape campaign. So you adopt your landscape and then talk about the story of your landscape over the next decade. So this is exciting. I think it's a great opportunity, and we can amplify the voice through all these different windows, and the moment is now.
Perfect. Amos, would you like to give any words to succeed what Musonda just said?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Musonda, for that very well articulated piece on the UN on ecosystem restoration, and also for giving us a very good background on how the decade can leverage on existing youth networks and movements. I think we are talking about a very powerful force. The youth are a very powerful force, a very unique amount of energy and human resource. I mean, if we don't make this better, if we don't utilize this human resource, human capacity, or human capital for the better, then I'm afraid we're going to lose this this human resource to other rivaling sectors that actually are in opposition to the youth, to the decade on ecosystem restoration. What am I talking about? How can we make this stronger? How can we build this youth movement, and how can we amplify it? One thing that Musonda highlighted is, I think, the using the digital space optimally. That's one aspect of it. But I want to move to the hard parts of it. I want to talk about nature-based employment. We see that one of the most urgent problems that the youth face, especially in developing nations, is employment. And just to highlight the message that actually with the UN decade on ecosystem restoration comes these opportunities is already a very massive step, and already trying to scale up these opportunities in some way. Because I understand the UN decade on ecosystem restoration is being led by FAO and the UNEP, very, very strong players there with very strong power to kind of build capacity in the youth movements. So two things that I am really eager to see. One of them is youth have demonstrated that they are keen on amplifying their actions. So why not build capacity in these actions? Why not mainstream youth voices into high-level policy frameworks, not just for the sake of, for the intent of having inclusivity or just to mainstream, but to act on these voices. One of them was the consultations. And I believe the youth are eager to see what comes out of the consultations and whether this is acted upon. And then the second one is UN Environment and FAO also have very strong arms in terms of rich in resources and their constituencies in different countries. I mean, this is a very good opportunity, rather, to invest in young people, invest in the human resource through strengthened institutional and, where allowed, budgetary provisions for youth action. I think those are the three most important things that I look that can come from the different non-youth and also, where possible, youth actors in this field. Thank you.
Perfect, Amos. Shie?
It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for the question. I think it's very important to address how these global platforms can uplift youth voices. What I have seen from the UN is that they are including youth voices in a lot of the things that they're doing. For example, the climate summit, we had a youth climate summit. My problem with that is that sometimes, because we are different ages, we fail to have conversations in the same space. And youth at this point are stakeholders of the future. So we have to be included in intergenerational conversation. So what I want to see is these spaces created for us to, like this space, intergenerational spaces for youth to actually say, you know, this is what we need from you, because we are here to raise our voices, because we want to have a future for our children and for ourselves, a future that has healthy biodiversity. One other thing that I think we have to work on all together is the difference between protecting biodiversity and fighting for climate justice. For some reason, these are seen as different things. And what I have seen is that if we want to tackle climate justice, we need to have healthy ecosystems and a strong biodiversity. So we have to keep telling our youth spaces, in our digital spaces, in these teaching spaces, that fighting for climate justice is the same thing as protecting and advocating for biodiversity, and just like against biodiversity loss. So I just wanted to share that I started this initiative called Viirs Initiative, which was started as a campaign for Earth Day. But afterwards, it exploded into an organization from youth around the world with over 200 volunteers. And recently, it was only supposed to be for Earth Day, but because we saw how strong the organization was and how everyone around the world was so eager to help, we decided to come together. And this acts as a teaching space for youth. And the UN has actually helped us. The UN Youth Envoy has helped us to uplift our voices. So she gave us space in her website so that we could write youth-written op-eds with our personal experiences from around the world, like Raphael was saying, because stories touch people in the way that data doesn't. So all of these things that I'm already seeing the UN do as an international body are very important, but I want to go a step further and say youth can actually be in these negotiating spaces, at least to listen and to say in an opinionated way, this is what we want to see in the world. This is what the resources that we need, like Amos said. This is the budget that we are looking for. These are the trainings that we need, because we're still not all the way, we're all still learning. And adults have to learn from the new wisdom of youth as much as we have to learn from the wisdom of adults.
Thank you, Shie. Raphael, before you move on to the next question, if you have any final words or thoughts.
Sure. Just building on what Shie and Amos said, storytelling is extremely important when it comes to climate action. And as Shie said, youth, I believe that the youth have become really the face of climate action over the past few years, because every day more and more young people want to get involved with climate activism, and their networks are growing by the day. And I was very happy to hear that the UN consulted with the youth in preparation for the decade on ecosystem restoration, because the youth oftentimes raise awareness and they tackle issues in creative ways that organizations maybe didn't think of beforehand, or just creative innovation. One example that I can think of right now is Reserva, the Youth Land Trust. It's an organization that empowers youth through land conservation, and they're working to create the world's first entirely youth-funded nature reserve in Ecuador. So it's great to hear, as Shie said, the UN support is very important in these movements and in these organizations. She mentioned the UN Youth Envoy support. It's extremely important to have these, because by promoting restoration, we can also amplify the impact of these youth movements. And it's a two-lane road. So as the UN promotes the youth movements promote restoration, and we'll work together to contribute as much as possible in the following decade.
Thanks so much, Raphael. So, Raphael, you work a lot with using media to change narratives and amplify local stories. This next question actually relates to what everyone in the world is sort of paying attention to right now, and that is COVID-19. So for obvious reasons, everybody is talking about this. And in this occasion, we're also seeing how young people are increasingly becoming aware of our social responsibilities to create a more inclusive and healthy society. So whether that's saluting our workers on the front lines, to providing extra face masks to essential service care providers, we see how young people are really taking the lead and also joining, as you said, Shie, this intergenerational movement to addressing a social injustice. So based on your experience, Raphael, we'll start with you and then we'll make our way backwards. How can young people become leaders in developing solutions to not just COVID-19, but building a sustainable and resilient future for everyone?
Thank you, Mayumi. Well, I think that not just young people, but people everywhere have really taken these past few months and this time of hardship to reflect on what's going on and what they can do to help, but also what's to come. And I believe that a lot of people are coming to the realization that if a virus is capable of doing this, just imagine what climate change is capable of, because it affects every aspect of society, from food security, migration, to conflict, and so on. But in my opinion, I think that everyone has a different way of tackling the issue. Whether it's through social activism, whether it's through media, whether it's through hands-on landscape restoration. My advice to these people, to all young people everywhere, is to see what you're good at and just build on that. I myself, I've taken this time during quarantine to start a communications project focused on sharing stories of climate action and making sure that marginalized voices can be heard, especially in Latin America, indigenous voices and communities that usually don't get the mainstream media attention. I believe that everybody has something to chip in when it comes to building a sustainable future, and local action leads to global change. So young people can become leaders just about anywhere in the world.
Perfect, Raphael. Xie?
I couldn't agree more with Raphael, because that's the philosophy that Viirs Initiative holds. Whatever your specific skill is, you can use it to amplify the climate movement. And we have seen that in many different instances. For example, in the strike movement, there's a lot of countries in which striking is illegal. So I have a few friends from Singapore who are part of Viirs Initiative, and they said, I'm so happy that this alternative form of youth activism exists, because I was never able to be part of it because I couldn't go out and strike. We have another friend who, she's amazing at graphic design, and she never felt like she could be part of what activism means in the mainstream media, because all she did was graphic design. So we are seeing that in spaces that we build as youth, we are able to uplift everybody's personal skills in order to maximize the movement and its impact. So I feel like youth can be extremely innovative into how to open spaces for each other. And we can also be very bold into having hard conversations about current race issues in the US and across the world, about indigenous people being the most affected by the fossil fuel industry, and all these issues that are happening that maybe a lot of adults don't talk about. We are talking about them, and we are making sure that they are present, and that these conversations don't make us uncomfortable anymore, because only through feeling uncomfortable at first are we going to be willing to make change. So, for example, what I did is I started Viirs Initiative because I am somebody who really believes in being connected worldwide in an equitable way. And the youth climate movement was something that I was seeing was very European and US led. So I wanted to make sure that Viirs Initiative was representative. And we have 14 youth from across the world in our main team who are all from different countries. And we translate all of our things to over 5 languages.
Wow, that's excellent, Xie. Thank you so much for that. Amos, we will go to you next.
Thank you very much, Xie and Raphael, for that well elaborate those views. I just want to highlight one thing that the COVID crisis had made the world to realize. I believe in leadership that is based on rational compromise, and this is what has been lacking in the world for so long. If just Raphael mentioned earlier on, if you turn on your TV right now, there's very few things you're going to see. You're not going to see climate change or landscape degradation, ecosystem degradation as a matter of urgency, as the other cases, such as the COVID crisis. And there is one thing people have to understand. I am hopeful that in the next people few months or 2 or 3 years or whatever it is, very soon, we will be able to have a vaccine for COVID. People are recovering from it. But think about climate change, think about ecosystem restoration. These are things that don't bounce back overnight. And these are things that need a leadership that is based on compromise. See, COVID broke our arms and made us realize that we compromised on a lot. Public transport was compromised. Industrial production, use of fossil fuels, a lot of things were compromised. And we've seen a lot of ecosystems bouncing back to life. But then, after the COVID crisis, shall we still be governed by leadership that is based on compromise towards landscape restoration, ecosystem restoration, climate change. Now, I want to bring your attention as young people, the audience that is listening to us out there, to this very point. Compromise doesn't have to be made by the big leaders. We're talking about youth leadership here. This compromise can be in anything. Your lifestyle. How did your lifestyle change for the sustainable bit of it during this compromise, during this COVID situation? Can you maintain that lifestyle? Can you transfer this sustainable lifestyle to someone else? I mean, we didn't die, but there was a compromise. We still live. It's for the good of the environment. How can we, I mean, these are very small things. Like, how do you use your time? Can you spend your time to educate other people? Can you use your time to build your knowledge on landscape issues, on ecosystem issues, and rather apply this knowledge to practice for the better of, I mean, it's all about, for me, it's all about compromise now. We learned this the hard way. We learned this through judgment from the COVID crisis. But then after the crisis, shall we continue to strike a compromise and give time, pay attention to the ecosystems that support us? That is a very important thing for me. It's about how we compromise, and you can compromise. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amos. And we will wrap this question up with Musonda.
Thank you very much, Mayumi. I'm so glad to really listen to the three of you in terms of your thoughts and how you see the future. Because what's exciting, quite frankly, in my opinion, is that most of the innovation that has emerged on this planet has come from young people. And I think the opportunity is now. Yesterday, I was moderating a session in the June Momentum for Climate Change under the UNFCCC, and listening to people from the German government, European community, and also other speakers. What is coming clearer is that this building back better or building back greener, what does that actually even look like? And I think this is where an opportunity lies for you guys to begin to unpack that. What does that actually really imply? Because you are not just the future, you are the present. The youth are the present. This word of saying, they're the future. No, they're the present. They're here now and really making the change in our communities. And so when we talk about nature-based solutions, what do those nature-based solutions look like around the restoration agenda? How do we do? And I liked your point, Shia, in terms of inclusivity. I think a number of initiatives are very northern-based, and so a lot of indigenous or southern-based communities or young people have been kind of sort of marginalized, for lack of a better term, or not been included. But what we're beginning to see with the Internet of Things and democratization of spaces is that these voices are now very visible, and sharing of experiences and all of that innovation that's happening, this exchange. And I'm glad that you've set up the Green Earth Initiative, which is fantastic, because then it brings all different stakeholders, fashion designers, graphic designers, people in transportation, news and media, Raphael, Amos, all of you in this way. So I think the opportunity is now, and what COVID has done is to really give us this window, because I feel personally that this has been a test run. This has been a test run. So with this test run, we know where the loops are, where the problems are, and we know that we can do this differently should a climate disaster hit. We know that we can live differently. And like you've said, Amos, our lifestyles, how we, our consumer lifestyles and how we've been treating the earth needs to change. Our food systems, how we grow our food needs to change. So it's really great that, your voices are already at the table and they're getting more and more amplified, but we need a lot more of that.
Thanks so much to all of you for your wonderful responses. So now we're actually going to enter the interactive part of the session. So the audience members have been raising questions through Huva, and I'm just going to ask a few questions to the four of you. So the first one is, again, in relation to COVID-19. And Amos, I'd like to start with you because you kind of talked a lot about how, we've reach this global awakening where we're realizing that we are actually compromising a lot. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, how has the emergence of COVID-19 shaped your own perception and your own understanding of how the UN decade will be implemented and succeed?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry.
Sure. So how has COVID-19 shaped your understanding and perception of how the UN decade will be implemented and succeed?
Well, quite a nice question, I must say. How has it shaped? I mean, I think as the UN a lot of things have changed, quite a lot. And as time progresses by, I don't know if the UN decade the strategies, I know there is definitely usually compromise being struck when we're setting up strategies. We want to see what we can get optimal results out of every strategy. And looking at the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, for me at this point, perhaps it would be important in relation to the COVID-19 crisis to begin to have a slight review on either now or midway or as along through the way on how to reshape this and to make sure that we fit some compromises that we have lived with during this COVID crisis and slot them into the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, so that even after the COVID crisis, we keep moving with a compromise that is rather fit to promote ecosystem health and restoration. Thank you. I hope I answered that person right.
Thanks so much, Amos. We will just quickly ask the same question to Musonda. How has COVID sort of shaped your understanding of how the UN decade will be implemented?
Thank you so much for that question. I think for when we talk about the decade on ecosystem restoration, and anyone who's read the resolution around the decade, it talks about what the impacts of degrading a landscape can do. So we know for sure that zoonosis is as a result of deforestation. And we've seen how Ebola and other diseases have broken out. And here we are in a space where we have a situation with this pandemic with coronavirus. And so I think for me, it's a wake-up call. And also the realities are that this decade is not cast in stone. It's a learning as we go along in progress. Even the strategies that we've developed for it are living documents. We go along. I mean, who knew that the whole world would be on lockdown? I mean, everybody's looking at 2020 like, okay, what just happened here? This has been a moment of reflection and thinking, we were all running about and getting busy that we're going to do this and do that. And then suddenly we're all on lockdown, the entire planet. So really a moment of reflection to say that if we do not restore these very ecosystems, we're even going to see worse off pandemics than what we've seen now, breaking out in different localities and even compromising the very systems that are supposed to keep us alive and intact. Look at how our health systems have been compromised. And similarly, what COVID has done is also demonstrate that if you're not healthy, if you don't have a good nutrition, and if you do not have a good immunity, most of this immunity comes from good food, good soils, a lot of them indigenous food systems, traditional agroecological systems. And if these are compromised, we're all compromised. And so it's been a learning curve. And I think it's an opportunity now to really rethink how we deliver on this decade going forward.
Excellent, Musonda. Thank you so much. I like the fact that you both of you mentioned that this is really an opportunity. And this next question, Xie, I will start with you because you talk about how your initiative is one that is very global in nature. And particularly this is to sort of address that we need to be more inclusive. This issue is something that affects all of us and disproportionately local and marginalized communities. So we need to not only think about, US-based organizing or European-based organizing, but we really need to make this a global movement. So I think you are already taking proactive steps in finding innovative ways to uplift and sort of address how we need to alleviate certain environmental injustices. So my question, or the audience's question actually, is what do we need to do differently in order to have young people truly activated?
I think that this question could also translate to what can we do to have communities truly activated? Because young people come from all these communities and we have an effect on our parents. We have an effect on how our school does things. We have even an effect on how our local government does things. Because if we show up, then we are going to have an effect on all these things. And I think the way in which we do that is truly through education, like I've said before. And it's not something that we're getting. We don't know. I didn't know I could go and speak to my politicians. I didn't know I could start an organization that was like a source of information. I didn't know all these things that are kind of kept from youth across the world because maybe people don't want us to empower ourselves. But at the same time, we have all these amazing organizations that want youth empowerment and that are pushing us forward. So, part of why we named Viirs Initiative Viirs is because we're thinking about reconnecting, we're thinking about rethinking, restoring. So I really like what has been said, because it is about all of those things. It's about rethinking our compromise. It's about reconnecting with Earth. It's about restoring the planet. And that is the approach that we're taking. And right now we are focusing on this campaign called Defend Defenders, which has a lot to do with Indigenous communities across the world who protect most of biodiversity across the world. So 80% of biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people. And we are really focusing on how in a lot of, especially global South countries, Indigenous climate activists get targeted by different companies because of the work that they're doing to protect the environment. So we are here to say, as the Youth Global Climate Movement, we want to protect protectors, because that is a really big source of knowledge, tradition, and just the livelihood that we enjoy across the world. So we are really trying to, because in this situation that we're in, we're getting really desensitized from information. I'm sure Raphael can speak more about this, but with the news cycle being so much about problems rather than solutions, we get desensitized to the problem. And in the youth space, we're trying to imagine a better future. We're trying to put into practice what that imagined future looks like. We're trying to put into practice what we want the world to see. And when that comes from all these youth voices across the world, and truly thousands of youth voices across the world, that is how the world is going to go into if we want to. So I think that's the target here, is to switch our mindsets into what is possible and align that with our spirit of wanting the world to be a better place.
Okay, thanks so much, Xie. So we are actually nearing the end of our session, but of course, Raphael, we just had answers from 3 of the speakers, and we know that you would be a wonderful person to give us some final thoughts. So do you have any final thoughts or hopes or expectations on today's forum?
Sure, yeah. Just one quick question. Should I follow up on the last question regarding what Xie said?
Yeah, feel free.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Yeah. Well, no, because I think she really highlighted just about all the main problems that I had in mind. Well, as a journalist, I think that in climate communications, our main issue here in Latin America is that when we're talking about climate, we're talking about climate activism, oftentimes they're US or Europe-based organizations and movements, like Shia mentioned, which is why I believe that these youth global movements are key in really democratizing the debate, because here in Latin America, you don't usually see, especially in Brazil, you don't usually see this information in Portuguese or even in indigenous languages. And I believe that we need to work to make this information available in local languages all around the world, because this is a crisis that impacts everyone. It's not going to impact a single group or a single nation. It's going to impact our entire species. And I believe that organizations such as the United Nations are working on turning the climate debate intergenerational, which is fantastic. They're being often very inclusive. Global Landscape Forum having this youth debate, it's all fantastic. But I believe that as the youth and as these youth movements grow all over the world, we need to pressure our governments and our local authorities to follow suit as well, to really listen to the youth voices. Because as we're very aware, there are countries in the world where we're taking steps back when it comes to preservation, one of them being my own. We see forest fires, we see growing deforestation, and we really need to pressure our government and the local authorities to really have our voices heard. And I believe that the youth really needs to focus on these key points when it comes to not only what we're doing right now, but the next decade of ecosystem restoration and onwards, because we are the future leaders of this world, and we need to have ecosystem restoration in focus to help combat climate change and keep us under 2 degrees.
Thanks, Raphael. And thanks so much to the 4 of you for your participation in this session. It was really great to hear about the work of how you are mobilizing locally and globally around the world. I just really want to say thank you again, Shea, Musonda, Amos, Rafael, and to the audience for participating and listening. If you have any questions, please pose your questions on Whova, and the GLF team will make sure to get back to you. Before I pass the floor back to Andrea, if you just have any quick thoughts or final statements, I will open the floor again. If not, we will actually move on to the next session, which is a restoration recipe.
Well, thank you for having me. And anybody can reach out and ask questions on how we can get this thing going, get the restoration agenda going. Thank you so much for your wonderful moderation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. What I can say is that we are in very difficult times in terms of the ecosystem health and so on. The assumption is that we have about a decade to flip things around in our favor on the right side. I don't think there's a better time for us to act, and we have to start acting now. Young people have to start assuming leadership. We have to, just as Musonda said, avoid this. We are the future. We are the present, actually. And there is no better time to act now. All right. Thank you very much for hosting me. I'll be open to any questions on Whova and yeah, wherever. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Yeah, I just want to also thank everybody for your time. And I just want to say that a lot of the times adults tell youth, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I want to tell you that you don't have to wait to grow up to be somebody. You can be somebody every day of your life because we have the power of agency to change the world.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone I want to thank Mayumi and Global Landscape Forums for having me here today. And just about as everyone highlighted, I want to say that it's never too early and never too late to take action. We can't be apathetic when it comes to climate change. We need to take action now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Andrea, I'll pass the floor on to you. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone.